Hey, welcome, and thanks for joining today's event hosted by the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. I'm Rear Admiral Mark Montgomery. I'm the Senior Director of FDD's Center on Cyber and Technology Innovation. Today's Wednesday, March 4th. We're here today to talk about authoritarian regimes that are gaining influence over how Americans understand the world. Legacy media has left a big void in content cited by large language models, and the authoritarian governments have been eager to fill this. By optimizing their authoritarian propaganda for AI consumption, foreign influence is shaping the narratives in AI tools relied on by millions of us for our research, our education, and our everyday information. Russian campaigns to shape AI narratives, Kremlin-aligned perspectives embedded in chatbot responses, and the rapid spread of Chinese-built AI models in the United States. All of this adds up to a serious and growing risk to American security. On this topic, FDD is proud to present a study of propaganda citation by AI tools, a memo, a discussion here that investigates how large language modules drive traffic to this propaganda, complicating the use of AI as a trustworthy research tool. To discuss these topics today, and critically the options available to policymakers, technologists, and the media ecosystem, I'm pleased to introduce Joseph Bodnar, Senior Research Manager at the Institute for Strategic Dialogue. Joe previously held research roles at the German Marshall Fund, the Atlantic Council, and has written widely on state-backed propaganda, Russian disinformation, and foreign interference. We also have my good friend, Jamil Jaffer, the founder and executive director of the National Security Institute at George Mason's and Antonin Scalia Law School, where I'm still just a senior fellow. I can't get that distinguished fellow. Thanks, Jamil.
We'll work on it. We'll work on it. We do a battlefield promotion if you'd like.
There we go. All right. He's also an assistant professor of law and director of the National Security Law and Policy and Cyber Intelligence and National Security LLM programs at George Mason University, where my nephew's a proud graduate of the law school. Jamil is also on CCTI's advisory board. Jamil, it's great to see you here. All right, moderating today's panel is FDD's own Leah Siskind. Leah wears dual hats at FDD. She's both Director of Impact, but really most importantly, she's the AI Research Fellow at FDD's Center on Cyber and Technology Innovation. She has a great new memo that I recommend to each of you entitled A Study of Propaganda Citations by AI Tools. It's available at the entrance. Before I turn it over to Leah and the panel, a few words about FDD. For almost 25 years, FDD has operated as a fiercely independent, nonpartisan research institute, exclusively focused on national security and foreign policy. As a point of pride and principle, we do not accept any foreign government funding. For more on FDD's work on cybersecurity, technology, AI, and more, please visit fdd.org, follow us on FDDX and Instagram, and subscribe on our YouTube channel. Leah, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Monty. Okay, let's dive right in. Today, I'm excited to discuss the findings of FDD's original research on authoritarian influence on large language models, which for here on out we'll just say LLMs. We had an excellent team of researchers and a brilliant technical editor, and some of whom are in the room right now. So I just really quickly wanted to acknowledge your help and say thank you so much. Thank you. This could not have happened without you. So the issue we discovered is that since most legacy media outlets are either blocking LLM bots for training and retrieval, they've created a massive void which is being filled by state-aligned authoritarian media. For our experiment, we studied 3 major international conflicts: Israel-Gaza, Taiwan-China, and Ukraine-Russia. We found that when analyzing 3 major large language LLMs, ChatGPT, Claude, and Gemini, that 52% of responses to questions about current international conflicts cited state-aligned propaganda sources. Understanding this void is just one piece of a larger puzzle, so I brought in 2 other experts to help us cover the full national security picture. I'm so pleased to be joined by Jamil and Joe to talk about the various ways adversarial actors are leveraging AI to disseminate propaganda. So thank you so much for joining us. Okay, I want to start with Joe. You found that Russian influence on American LLMs manifests in a lot of different ways. Can you help recap your research for us and tell us about Russian strategy and tactics for AI influence?
Yes, so just for some background on me, I primarily track Russian influence operations, and there was prior research done that showed some covert information operations had been able to successfully influence the output of chatbots. So our question was, has overt propaganda been able to do the same thing? Have the RTs and the TASSs of the world been able to get cited?
Wait, RT is not a legitimate news source? I have friends in DC who literally watch RT like it's actual news.
Yeah, that happens.
Maybe the DNI, maybe even. Nope, I didn't say it out loud.
So we were interested in this question to see who besides his friends were getting served RT. And our approach to it was kind of varied because we were interested in a lot of different variables. So we looked at 4 chatbots, ChatGPT, Gemini, Grok, and DeepSeek, because we wanted different capabilities and different design philosophies. Then we picked 5 topics related to the war in Ukraine to see if there was any particular topics where there might be data voids and some that have maybe less data voids. And we designed 3 layers of questions. This is a lot. 3 layers of questions, neutral, bias, and malicious. And then we asked those questions in 5 different languages. So the result of all of that, the big takeaway for me was about 1 in 5 of all of our queries returned citations of Russian state media. And that number, the percentage of citations, increased from neutral to malicious. So each time the level of bias increased, we saw more Russian propaganda. We also saw the models behave differently. ChatGPT it performed the worst in our testing. And it was also the most susceptible to being influenced by that bias. Grok was actually kind of difficult. So it did cite Russian state media, but it also cited a lot of pro-Russia influencers on X that would surface their posts. That didn't fall, we didn't categorize that as part of our data. More studies need to be done into that, but since they weren't directly, overtly connected to Russian state media, we didn't catalog it. DeepSeek, incredibly variable. Some questions returned limited Russian propaganda. Others, it was only Russian propaganda and covert IO responses. That informed the entirety of DeepSeek's response. And then credit where it's due, Gemini did really well. It put warnings on a lot of things, saying that if we were looking for information on a conflict, we should consult reputable sources and not an LLM. One thing to note, language didn't have as much of an impact as we thought. So we asked questions in 5 languages, and it wasn't a variable that caused any statistical variation. There's a lot more research to be done in this space. New AI models are coming out, more tests need to be done, and AI summaries are working their way into literally everything. Google search in particular, I think, is problematic, but that's for future talks, maybe.
And just to note that aligns with our research as well. ChatGPT was kind of a shit show, and Gemini was much.
Are we allowed to say that?
I think so. I hope so.
We're live streaming right now, so we did. No FCC to bleep you out.
So how much of this is deliberate Russian strategy, and how much of it is how much of that do you think results in filling a void, a data void?
I think it's both. It's certainly a deliberate Russian strategy. So we can look to quotes from people like John Mark Dougan. I hope not everybody here knows who John Mark Dougan is. He's a former Florida cop who is now notorious for running a group of hundreds of fake local news sites that are called cop sites. And at a roundtable last year, he was actually complaining about how the AI models he was using to produce content for those sites had too much Western bias in it. And he said, we need to train it from the Russian perspective. So copy.
He's an American?
He lives in Russia now.
Oh, well, yeah.
But he was.
Kind of like Edward Snowden.
Yes. I would not be surprised if they were in the same city.
There you go.
But cop sites, they put out so much content. To my knowledge, none of them have appeared in LLM results. They're kind of just sitting there on the web. I don't know if they're being scraped and things like that. The big player in this game is another IO called the Pravda Network, collection of dozens and dozens of sites, publishing a flood of content, 7 million articles to date. And that's where the term LLM grooming kind of came from, originated with studies into this, because it does look like it's deliberately set up to influence the output of LLMs. And in some studies, it's shown it's able to do so.
Jamil, this has been a very busy couple of weeks for Chinese AI misuse. While everyone was distracted by the Claude DOW showdown, I know you have strong feelings too, China was caught stealing knowledge from Claude and using ChatGPT to review one of their influence campaigns where they were trying to influence the Japanese election and attempting to silence critics of China in America by impersonating US government officials. This shows that despite all of their advancements, they still see American AI tools as superior. And when it comes to building their own models, they are essentially learning from American AI and then applying Chinese censorship filters on top. So knowing what we know about Russia's use of AI for influence operations, can you contrast this with China's approach?
Well, you know, what China's been doing, let's be clear, now that Anthropic's come out with a report talking about distillation, we now know pretty uncontrovertibly that a lot of the Chinese tools that have made it onto the open market, the DeepSeeks, the Quens, the Kimmys, are all trained on the output of American closed source models and have been distilled down. And so we know that they're essentially doing what they've done in every other IP area, stealing the American intellectual property, repurposing it in China, and then putting it out on the market. So we know that's part of what's going on here. But then when you look at what they're doing with those tools, you see them both for their own home audiences, but also for foreign audiences, ensuring that when those tools are utilized, they're putting out content that aligns with the Chinese state view of the world, right? So you see when you ask DeepSeek or Quen or Kimmy, and they vary amongst one another. I don't want to lump them all together, but with some variations, you ask the questions about Taiwan, they give you more state influence views than sort of the standards than what you might get for a normal American model, right? You get views about Falun Gong and the like. When you ask them about Tiananmen, obviously, you know, Tiananmen what, right? And so there is. It's clear they're trying to shape the information environment, right? It's less than undermine the models themselves, right? Which I don't doubt that their narratives, right, that they're putting out through their media organizations are also being pulled in the way that your studies have shown. So that's happening already. But on top of that, if you use their models, and the real problem is a lot of American companies are going deep on their models.
Yeah, we're
right?
gonna come back to this.
They're implementing their models in their core operating. Well, they're like, well, look, we're not putting out information. It's fine. We're just using it to, do an internal app. But the problem is, if we know they're influencing the outcomes of news stories and research, what else would they influence the outcome of inside your business that you don't know, right? And so I think American companies have to step very carefully. If you're implementing DeepSeek, Quen, or Kimmy, I get it, you're saving a bunch of money, but that may come at a much larger cost down the road.
I want to come back to that because it's such an important point, and we need to talk about solutions and how to approach this. But first, Joe, both of our research found that chatbots tend to show confirmation bias, which means that how you phrase the prompt can lead to reinforcing that perspective. Can you talk about the national security implications of that?
This is tough because it gives actors who want to run these info ops a shortcut. They can go to these chatbots, prompt it, and get it to produce tons of content that isn't copy pasta, as I was actually just talking about with Max here, and feed it to users in different languages around the world. It's just a tool that speeds up these info ops that are becoming increasingly problematic as the pace of news accelerates and people's hunger for it increases too.
And you talked briefly about the Pravda network, which operates in over 80 countries, and they essentially launder Kremlin talking points through locally branded sites that appear independent. So how does this kind of distributed infrastructure make it harder for LLMs or anyone to filter propaganda?
Can you ask the question one more time?
Sure. So we're talking about Pravda and how
Yeah.
it operates in so many different languages,
Yeah.
in 80 different countries, but because it's kind of it's filtered often through locally branded sites. It's a network of sites, right?
Mm-hmm.
So how does this kind of distributed architecture make it harder for LLMs to identify, or any person to identify that this is propaganda?
I mean, if they're targeting environments where there isn't a lot of good news sources, and they're flooding those environments with bad content, that content's going to get scraped. It's more likely to get picked up, and that's problematic.
Yeah, that's good to know.
You know what, like, what's really interesting about this, though? You know, you might think, okay, we need to bake into these tools the ability to ignore these sites, right? Remove the prompted network sites from your models. But let's say you did that, right? At least some people are going to say, well, that's a woke approach, right? You're gerrymandering the model, right? I mean, I think that Grok would say to you, you know, the people who created Grok would say that's not an appropriate thing. We're not going to police that content.
Yeah.
It's part of why Grok is using all these the folks that you didn't identify, but the sort of the Russian influencers on Twitter, right, or to X, right?
Yeah.
That's a problem.
Yeah, and when we talk about prompted, those aren't hard sites to identify, and we don't have to get rid of them completely. All these prompted sites are cataloged. A lot of researchers know what they are. AI companies know what they are. You don't have to blacklist them completely. You can downrank them in your results.
Exactly.
You can label them as state-affiliated media so end users have that context.
Yes.
There's ways to do this that isn't censorship.
Yes, I would never advocate for blocking these sites. People need to be able to read and understand, alternative points of view, but they should know what they're reading.
Exactly.
So I'll come back to this. Jamil, so it's beyond influence operations. We know that China is also, actively stealing our intellectual property and using this knowledge to improve their own models. What does this say about the state of the AI race between the U.S. and China? I think it's good, we're all following this, but I think it's good to kind of level set on where are we right now?
Well, you know, there's sort of a popular theory of the case that China's winning. They've got all these models are coming in cheaper, they're coming in better, faster, whatever the thing is. And as a result, a lot of American companies we talked about earlier are starting to implement those models into their ecosystems, thinking, well, it's just cheaper, faster, better, whatever. Who cares if it's Chinese? I've got all sorts of Chinese equipment in my operation. So what's the big deal? One more thing at the core of my AI. The problem, of course, with that is that we don't know how that's going to play out in the long run, right? It's one thing to say we've learned this lesson. We learned this lesson from Huawei and ZTE. British Telecom put Huawei at the core of its network. Even as we told them not to do it, they're now having to rip it out. A lot of American local telecoms. But you can't rip out AI models from your infrastructure, right? You can't rip out the decisions you made based on that knowledge. And remember, the decisions only have to be modified by a slight amount, right? Your thinking on a given issue has to only move by a little bit to make huge differences down the road in your business. It could be imperceptible, undetectable amounts of change, right? It's not going to be as obvious as no Tiananmen, right? No pro-Taiwan messaging. We just don't know. And this idea that American companies are blithely adopting models, is a problem. But going back to your earlier question, the core of your question was this: where we are in the race. I think what it demonstrates is we're still winning, right? We don't need to necessarily make America great again on AI. We're great on AI. We're winning the AI race. The problem is we can't allow the Chinese to get ahead. And so there's all these debates about, what chips we sell to China, right? How much, how little. And these are important debates to be had, and there are reasonable views on all sides of this. But the reality is, if you give China high-end American capabilities, right, whether that's allowing them to get access to our core IP on our models, or the highest end of American chips, or even maybe the mid-range of American chips, that's going to accelerate their ability. And a lot of people will say, well, look, they're already going to build them, whatever, right? But that 2-3 years delay, that might matter a lot. And that's why it's been so controversial and such a hotly debated issue. There are important economic things to consider as well, but at the end of the day, we are winning the AI race, and China's borrowing our models because they know we're winning.
Yeah, that's a very helpful recap. Sorry. Joe, our research found something counterintuitive, which was that Google actually surfaces less propaganda over Gemini than LLMs do. Oh, sorry, let me rephrase this. My research found that when we compared searching for certain topics through LLMs or through standard Google search, that Google would surface less propaganda. Because for Google...
As compared to Gemini?
Yes, because for Google, the link is the product. It doesn't have to, it can rank New York Times highly even if it can't read it. But an LM needs to actually be able to read the content in order to summarize and cite it. So which means that paywall journalism is effectively invisible for LLMs. State media, which is free and accessible, fills that void. So the question becomes, we started to talk about this before. Should AI companies be required to rank or weigh media outlets by credibility? And if so, who decides what credible means? And Jamil, you're welcome to weigh in on this as well.
Yeah, who decides what's credible is a very difficult thing to say. I don't want to wade into that. What I would say, just to repeat an earlier point I made, is that when some content, some domains are tied to state sources and in the past have pushed false and misleading content, downrank them. Try to surface what is credible Again, we can have a debate about what that is. But I think to your point about Google search being a little bit better at this, they've had a lot of time to wrestle with this problem. They've understood that the links are the threat vector. Like that's the threat. I don't know if these AI companies have come to terms with that yet. And we've seen like Google has worked to get rid of data voids. They know how search engine optimization has been exploited by bad actors. I don't know if AI companies have really gotten their head around this, and that's why our reports are hopefully pushing them to do something.
Yes, I've got a few thoughts. One, I think we all know what's credible and what's not, right? And you ought to apply a common sense rule here, right? If it's Russian state media, right, or Russian state affiliated, or Chinese state affiliated, or Iranian state affiliated, or North Korean state affiliated, let's be American companies and just think through that for a second, right? You don't need to be woke, or you don't need to be, you just have to apply a common sense rule. And I don't believe that's censorship. I think that is perfectly appropriate. It's something we've always done, we've always thought through. I don't see it as censorship.
It's the opposite of woke.
What's that?
It's the opposite
right.
of woke.
Well, I mean, but there are those who would say, well, you really got to give the American people full access to whatever they want, so they can figure out for themselves and not shade it at all, and not up or down rank because. But we've always understood our media companies to be able to help curate content for the American public in ways that are pro-democracy and pro-freedom. And let's be real. Iran, Russia, China, North Korea are not pro-democracy or pro-freedom, and that's okay to say that. It's not problematic to say that. It's common sense, and it's not insane. But here's the other piece of it. I actually think that the markets can help solve this problem. So to date, you've had market pressures on New York Times and Wall Street Journal, all those other media outlets to paywall their sites. But now, if the driver, right, are the LLMs, you almost want to be the LLM training data. They've been fighting and suing all these LLM companies. But the real truth is you actually want to be that training set because you want to be cited. You want the click through to your stuff so you can then monetize that. And so if you're not doing that, you're actually undermining your own economic rationale. So I think there's an opportunity here to get an economic deal done when these companies start realizing it's actually their materials being undermined by the Pravdas and the RTs of the world. And then I think the third piece of this is the companies actually have an incentive to get the right data out there, right? At the end of the day, if your AI capabilities aren't trusted, safe, and secure, if people start getting a lot of Russian content and they don't want that, so one, it has to require consumers who are educated and understand what Russian content, Chinese content looks like. But if the American people, and TikTok I guess is a counterpoint to this, but as the American people start to understand that that's what they're getting, they're not going to want that. So they I think will over time, if we're able to educate the American public, and the Western public, will start downgrading and using the tools that are less cautious and less cognizant of these problems, right? Yeah. And so I actually think there's incentives for investors and innovators to do the right thing here too, and to get the right kind of content, the right kind of training data, and the right kind of output data, so that we get real, valid, accurate content coming out. I mean, we've seen that with hallucinations. Yeah. This is the modern version of hallucinations. Yeah. They're not hallucinations because they're intentionally put in messaging, but it's still messaging.
Absolutely. I feel that both the media and the AI companies have like a deep vested interest in collaborating with each other. I lost my place. Jamil, DeepSeek became a cultural moment in early 2025 when we learned that the Chinese could produce a competitive model that is significantly cheaper for consumers.
A stolen, as it turns out, competitive model.
Yes. Can you talk about how they censored controversial topics? You've kind of hit on this a bit already. But.
Yeah. Well, we've seen a lot of reporting about this, right? So what we know is they've gerrymandered the inner workings of DeepSeek so that when you ask questions about topics that they don't want to talk about, and it's primarily, to be fair to them, it's primarily for their domestic audiences, right? But it turns out when you start implementing them here and start using them here, and people start adopting DeepSeek because it's so cheap and so fast, you start getting that same bad content. And so we saw, right? Taiwan stories came out the Chinese side, right? And again, the various models, they're different, right? Mm-hmm. DeepSeek isn't the same as Quen, isn't the same as Kimi, but they all have a layer because, unlike in the United States, albeit some debates today about whether that's more or less true in any given scenario, we have this sort of notional separation between church and state, between private and public. In China, that's not a thing, and so as they build these models, if you're an American, you got to know if I'm using DeepSeek, I'm getting Chinese state propaganda at some level, and that's what you saw. You saw Falun Gong downgraded, and there's other there's even more pernicious stuff that we should talk about. That's not sort of messaging only. That's about the output you get from as they're coding stuff for you. If you use DeepSeek to code,
Yeah.
But that's a larger problem. But you got problems on Falun Gong, you got problems on Taiwan, you got problems on Tiananmen Square, and those are the obvious ones, right? But if it's happening with the obvious ones, you can almost be guaranteed it's happening with the non-obvious stuff too. It's just more subtle. It's more cautious. The Chinese are not stupid. They know what they're doing. This is a planned and executed operation. And the Russians are really good at this. Chinese are getting better every day. And if we start embedding these models and start using them aggressively, as you've seen the uptake, this cultural moment, as you called it, it's, you do it at your peril if you're an American company.
So, yeah, and besides DeepSeek, now that we have Kimi and Quen and like so many other ones, what should Americans understand about what they're handing over when they use a Chinese-built AI model,
Yeah.
like that is trained on PRC data and their censorship laws?
Yeah.
Like, what are the data risks?
So a couple things. One, people say, well, look, I can just run DeepSeek locally, and it's fine. I'll just put it on my computer. Nothing will get out. Well, A, are you sure? Right? Can you guarantee nothing's getting out? Right? Are you monitoring the back end of your network to make sure nothing's leaving? I think that's an open question, right? But number two, right? If you're getting content that's been gerrymandered, right? Let's say you're now using it the way you use Claude Code to create applications. Those applications may be gerrymandered in ways that you just don't understand. And it turns out that at least a couple of reports, CrowdStrike being the most prominent one, has determined that in fact, when DeepSeek thought it was building something for a Falun Gong practitioner or a Falun Gong group, they gave more vulnerable code. Think about if that's happening at the core of your company. You've invested hundreds of millions of dollars in a company. You think, I'm just going to use DeepSeek on the cheap, save a few bucks on the tokens, right? Claude's too expensive, whatever it might be, right? I don't want to use Cursor. So I'm going to use DeepSeek. It'll just be faster, easier. That's a problem, right? Because it could be burying those vulnerabilities in your code, and you don't even note it. And if that's what's happening, how will you know when that code is exploited? You may not ever know.
Absolutely. No, I think that's very scary. And I don't think we talk nearly enough about that. So let's talk about some solutions. We're at an inflection point, I believe, where AI is becoming as foundational as the internet itself.
More.
Yeah. And in my research, I say that the onus is on AI companies because they need quality journalism, as we discussed, to create quality AI. If they continue to, if the media companies continue to withhold their information, the AI models need better, they need new streams of data, they need quality data to train on. If they continue in this direction, like the outputs are going to be lower quality. They need it for training and for retrieval. One thing that, when we're talking about the ability or the lack of ability for the models to detect propaganda, one thing that stood out from our study was that for all the different conflicts that we studied, it would, I mean, it was ChatGPT, to be honest, it would cite Al-Mayadeen, which is a Hezbollah publication, which is designated as a supporter of terrorism, and it would be questions of Taiwan, about maritime issues, like it was so random. But the fact that the models themselves could not distinguish between what is propaganda and what is a reputable source was pretty shocking. So
Common sense could help you figure that out.
Exactly. So I believe that AI companies have a responsibility. I personally believe that AI companies have a responsibility to label state-aligned propaganda.
Yeah.
This is not impossible. Companies have done this before. YouTube did this at one point. And I think you can avoid like the domestic controversy, like is this being woke issues by focusing on foreign propaganda.
Although that's even generated controversy in the whole woke moment, right? Even when you label foreign propaganda, there are those in the United States, those who want to make America great, who say, well, you're gerrymandering the dynamics. So it's not unanimous.
Definitely. Like, no matter what, it'll create controversy. But I think people have the right to know what they're reading.
Certainly. I was thinking of the dust-up. I mean, when Musk took over X, or then Twitter, he got rid of the state media labels.
Right.
But before he did that, he actually added state media labels to the BBC and the NPR. And there's a difference between these two things, where one has editorial independence but funding, and the others do not.
And it's okay to say that because we live in a free and democratic society, and we shouldn't shy away from being okay with treating Russian content different than American or British content. That's okay.
100%.
And that's why we said state aligned in our research, because, yeah, we're not talking about NPR, we're not talking about BBC or NPR when it received government funding, because these organizations still have editorial independence, even if they take money from the government. So all of the outlets that we focused on were, they're operating in an environment where there is no press freedom, and their editorial line parrots the government's take on things.
From my really nerdy perch, I think it could be a little bit more challenging than just the common sense approach. There is the common sense approach, but there's also new domains being created every day by these actors. There's old domains that are then being filtered through mirror domains. So it's going to take, I think the onus is on AI companies, but they're going to have to collaborate with researchers and civil society organizations to create that repository that gets continually updated, because threat actors are continually evolving. We can't just have one list and drop it there.
For Russia specifically, how can we protect American AI tools from Russian influence?
I think I've talked about it a bit here. I mean, we've talked about labeling. I just talked about creating a repository. They can do things like testing against these vulnerabilities and then making the results of those tests public. So we know how safe these models are and if we should be on the lookout for Russian sources slipping through. And I think that's something that should be done on a continual basis.
There is some debate on whether the LM grooming is effective or not. What's your take on it?
It's so hard to know. I mean, we don't have enough data.
And just to redefine that, that's flooding the zone with
yeah.
tons of media.
Yeah, it's putting enough content out there that it gets vacuumed into the training data and influences what chatbots say. And it's so hard to know how effective they are because we don't know what sources they're ingesting. We don't know how they weigh those sources. We just don't have enough insight into the way these models operate. All we can do, we're not totally blind, because we can red team. And we can get our own results, and we can sit on panels, and we can talk about them. But we just don't have enough data to know if an LLM has been groomed.
Jamil, what steps should the United States take to prevent Chinese models from continuing to profit from intellectual property theft?
Well, look, we've got to take action against the state itself. We know that this intellectual property theft that's happening at massive scale and has for decades has really funded the Chinese economy. It's grown the Chinese economy massively, and it's run by the nation state, right? When they hacked into American systems, American companies, stole intellectual property and brought it over to China and repurposed it, that was a state-run plan. The same thing is happening with the AI models. It may be through their private sector companies, but again, in China, there's no real difference between state and private. Every Chinese private, quote-unquote, private company has a CCP, party apparatchik at the top, right? Even a committee. And at TikTok, ByteDance, no exception, by the way. Even with the current sort of segregation of US TikTok, it's not real, let's be honest. And so the only way that we're going to prevent the Chinese from stealing American intellectual property and repurposing it for economic purposes and against our national security is to press our state up against theirs and put pressure on them. So tariffs have been one tool this current president has used to effectuate that. Joe Biden had different tools, President Biden had different tools. At the end of the day, though, none of these have worked enough because we haven't been tough enough. The reality is if we're going to fight fire with fire, we have to punch the Chinese in the teeth in public regularly until they start owning up to what they're doing and stop doing it. And the more we think that we can negotiate with them and cut a deal before they really take ownership, the more likely it is that they will continue to do it because they get away with it over and over and over again. And that's been a bipartisan problem. Trump 1 was very tough on China, right? Trump 2 on China is a lot more, it looks tough on tariffs, but in reality, we're selling them a ton of chips. We're trying to do a deal. The president says repeatedly over and over again how much he loves Xi Jinping, how much he thinks he can do a deal. He's going to Beijing. That demonstrates weakness. The president likes being strong and tough. Every time he says, I love Xi Jinping, I'm going to go do a deal with him, the more Xi Jinping, and by the way, same thing with Vladimir Putin in Ukraine, they see weakness, they see blood in the water, and they will wait him out, and they will ultimately extract a better deal for themselves. That's bad for America, bad for the president, his own view of himself, and ultimately not the right way to negotiate these things.
That's super interesting. So the signaling the willingness to negotiate is actually a weakness.
That's right. And in fact, you see our national security strategy, it says, well, it's fine for China to have their space. We're not trying to dominate them. We're not trying to win this thing. The reality is, why shouldn't we be trying to win against China? We should be trying to win, right? Making America great again is not just about doing it at home. It's about abroad. And the president's showing that in the Middle East. He showed it in Venezuela. Why isn't he showing it with China? Why is he, well, they get to have their space and we have ours too. No. We should want to win against China. That's okay. We should just say it out loud.
That's very interesting. Joe, one of the more alarming findings in my research, was that when users would click through to verify the answers, the outputs in AI, which is like what good, responsible AI use looks like. We're all taught that this is how you prevent or how you discover hallucinations. If you click that, you ensure that you're not having them by checking the sources to be safe.
Right.
But in my research, I found that the models would produce like pretty comprehensive answers, but then when you would click on the citations, you would get a much more extreme perspective than the LLM itself. So the LLMs were kind of moderating themselves, but obviously the citations were not. How does that dynamically map onto what you've seen in Russia's disinformation strategy?
We actually didn't go down that rabbit hole. So I'm interested to hear your take on it, because it seems like you did follow that rabbit hole.
I mean, yeah, I can say from our research, like we studied, like I mentioned before, 3 different conflicts, and there were certain actors who really dominated citations. Al Jazeera was far and away the leader on a range of issues, but of course on Israel-Gaza coverage, even in neutral questions that we asked about the conflict. I think they were in over 70% of the questions neutral questions that we would pose, you're going to get an Al Jazeera citation,
Wow.
which was very interesting. And by the way, a lot of this comes down to media literacy and understanding. Like, just because you have a slick website does not mean that this is the kind of liberal Western journalism that we're used to.
And we know in the case of Al Jazeera, it's not.
Absolutely. It's run by the royal family. So they have no press freedom. It's completely aligned with the government. But because they don't have a paywall and it's totally open, they're doing a lot of other things. In fact, they're far and away the best I've seen ever at optimizing their content for AI. But I bring this back to our study, because when we would ask specific factual questions, with numbers, like what % of Gaza in this moment in time is being controlled by the Israeli military. The LLM would, balance different sources, and it would come back with 40%. And then it would cite Al Jazeera in the same line, and that article, the headline would be, Israeli military controls 70% of Gaza. And then they would include another one by a Hamas-linked NGO that would say, Israel controls 80%. So if you're trying to be an educated reader and read your sources along with the material, it's going to give you a very different impression.
Yeah.
That's a hard problem to solve for, right?
Yeah.
Because the LLM is ultimately getting you a right-ish answer, right? As it tries to moderate the various sources it's looking at. But then it's giving you sources that have a lot worse and not quality answers. How do you solve for that? To your point, maybe it's labeling, maybe it's the like. What I wouldn't want to see is a requirement from the federal government, right, or state governments, or worse, the EU, right, that you have to label things and the like. I think there are strong market incentives, to your point, and to what Joe said, for these companies to do this smartly and in an effective way. We haven't fully seen it yet. A lot of people are saying, well, now we need to regulate because they're not doing it today. I think that's the wrong answer. I think, or that we need to give equal time, right? It's such a funny thing, because equal time used to be a problem for conservatives. Now it's like a popular thing amongst conservatives. I don't really get it. But Ronald Reagan had it right, which is the market can figure it out. This will work out over time, and the LLMs are seeing that result playing out. They're going to figure this out. We don't need to sprint to regulation to solve these problems. What we need is more people like you guys talking about these things and doing the studies you're doing.
I'm a little more skeptical about market forces here,
Yeah.
I'm going to be honest, because we can look at social media as an example. They did initially react to this, and then they've rolled it all back, and they're all doing okay. Like state media labels are gone. CrowdTangle for research into meta products is gone, and those platforms are still, they still have users going to them every day.
But to
The
me,
market
that's
hasn't
an
solved it.
education problem, right? To me, you're right. The market hasn't gotten to the optimal results. You could have two views of that.
Yeah.
It could be that the market doesn't have sufficient information for consumers to make good choices, right? That we're lacking information. It's not a good market, right?
Okay.
Or you could, and your answer could be, how do I solve for that? Allow more information to flow in the market, educate consumers, have them be smarter on how they consume. Or you could say the government should step in and regulate, right, and solve for this. My view is that latter approach, the government regulating, is actually cause more losses and cause more lack of confidence in what you get, particularly in America, where we're skeptical of government intervention information, rather than allowing more information to flow in the market, educate consumers about what is real and what's not real, and have them put the pressure on the market for the market to change.
Can I ask a question to you, Joe? Because you
Yeah.
brought up the EU, and we haven't really talked about Europe at all. And your study obviously focused on 5 different languages, had a more European focus.
Yeah.
And the EU has been pushing AI companies towards adopting the disinformation code and flagging sanctioned media and chatbot outputs. The
Yeah.
US is obviously taking a very different approach. Are there things that Europe is doing on a specific problem that we should be borrowing?
I don't know if they're doing enough on chatbot responses. That was part of our recommendations, was that they do need to clarify their position on how chatbots handle sanctioned media, because I don't know if that's clear. Those laws were designed for social media platforms, and now that these chatbots are on the rise and their user bases are getting them into the realm of being a very large online platform, which would put them under regulatory pressure or obligations, they need to clarify what that looks like.
Interesting.
The one other thing to just say about regulation, right, is that regulation also tends to lock in the larger players that are already in the market. So if you want innovation and you want people to come into the market and be more innovative, the more you regulate, the less likely you are to have those startups who can come in and afford the cost of regulation to do that. Now, the reality is in the LLM world, it's already very costly to be a startup player.
Yeah.
You need huge amounts of investment in data and the like. But the more you regulate, the less innovation you're going to get. Proof's in the pudding. Look at innovation in Europe. They regulate every day, every single thing, right? They regulate first, innovate second. We innovate first, regulate second. That's the right approach. I'd go America than Europe.
Well, also, AI agents are going to disrupt all of this anyways, and for social media labeling, who knows, maybe in 10 years we'll have like 20 new social media companies and we won't be reliant on the monopoly that we have now.
We'll all be reading Moltbot.
Yeah, exactly. Or our bots will be reading Moltbot.
Exactly.
Jamil, how should we talked about the risks of American companies using Chinese models or building tools on top of Chinese models. How should we encourage transparency around the use of Chinese models in America?
Well, look, I do think it would be appropriate for the U.S. government, particularly for critical infrastructure providers and the like, to say we want to know when you're using Chinese models, government contractors. We want to know if those are embedded in your capabilities that you're supplying to us, right, or that you're supplying to, or that you're using for critical infrastructure operations that go to America's national and economic security. And so I think that's a reasonable form of transparency. If you're using foreign capabilities in the core of your operations, you should be required to tell the public and the government about that. I think it's different when it's, if you're using American capabilities, I don't think you should necessarily have to disclose that. But if you're using foreign capabilities, I think that's perfectly appropriate. We've done it in a variety of other contexts. There's nothing unusual about that. And to be candid, we barred the use of certain foreign capabilities, Huawei, ZT, the most prominent recent example is Kaspersky before it. I don't even think that's necessarily a bridge too far. We're not there today. And actually, the adoption's been significant.
Well, DeepSeek on federal devices.
Yeah, on federal devices. But
Yeah.
the real problem is, the real pernicious problem is in American companies and critical infrastructure providers. And the fact that having watched the Huawei ZT thing go down, having heard the debate over TikTok, albeit, all bollocksed up in the last year or so, the reality is that American companies should know better. American boards of directors should know better. And maybe this is partly educating company executives and boards of directors. These are bad trade-offs they're making for the slightly cheaper tokens, the slightly cheaper inference. You're making huge mistakes that could go at the heart of the value of your company. And by the way, the core intellectual property that you're now pouring into these models, some of which may be going back to Beijing.
Yeah, I think reading a couple weeks ago, or just learning that Airbnb is using Quen was kind of a surprise moment for me to understand that. For both of you, what does successful collaboration with between policymakers and technologists look like to you? And the media, sorry.
I'll let you kick that one off.
Well, look, I tend to believe that technology and policy can go hand in hand. That there doesn't need to be this sort of divide of the Valley over here and DC over here. There's a lot of common ground that we have and a lot of common shared values. A lot of people tend to think that there's this real massive gulf of values between us, and there really isn't. I think part of the problem is that we've sort of lost our way in thinking about what makes America special and different, right? What makes America special and different is the opportunity we give people to come here, become part of the American vision and dream, and integrate into our society and grow the society writ large. In recent years, we've forgotten that sort of core of America, and we've allowed that to infect all of the way we think about the way that companies collaborate with the government, right? We see it playing out in this Anthropic DOW thing, but it goes back in the old days when Google and Maven happened, right? We're just seeing that thing recrop its head up, even as we're in a more sort of collaborative environment with industry and government than we've ever been. So I think there's a lot of room for collaboration. I think there's a lot of room for cooperation. I don't think we need heavy-handed government regulation to make that happen. I think the government and industry can and should work together effectively. And the one thing I really hate about a lot of our big companies, they often will say, well, now that we've grown to a certain size, we're really global in nature. But the real truth about all these global corporations is they never call the Chinese MSS when they have a problem. They never call the Iranian MOIS, right? They call NSA, they call FBI, they call DHS, and there's a reason for that. It's because they're American companies first. There's a reason why they're still headquartered here and not in Moscow and not in Bermuda and not elsewhere, because they benefit from being US headquartered and American. They benefit from worker base, they benefit from innovation, they benefit from all those things, tax policy and the like. That means that they should have some responsibility too, and the market should force that responsibility upon them. And we've allowed this sort of we're a global corporation thing to go for too long.
Interesting. Joe?
I'm going to leave the policy questions to you two. I'm an OSINT nerd, so if you have any questions that get into that data, I'm happy.
Well, that's fun. So before we turn actually to the audience Q&A, I do have a final question. We've spent a lot of time talking about sophisticated state actors and complex technical vulnerabilities, but the average person, for the average person using ChatGPT to research a news story, they have no idea that all of this is happening. What is the single most important thing you would want an everyday AI user to understand after today?
That's a tough question, and I think it gets to your point of, I just want to say verify your sources. To make sure the information that it's giving you, go check those citations. Make sure it's actually what's being represented in your chat is actually what was written by the reputable source that it's citing.
But I think we have to go much further than that, because it's checking your sources is not, we're like
They
actually.
got to be reputable.
Yeah, I think you need to incorporate some media literacy with it, because right now we're just driving. Like imagine, K through 12 systems are rolling out these tools, and they're all trying to figure out how to incorporate this in the learning environment. And it's like when you're teaching children, you have to cite a source, and we're driving people to these different sources and saying, okay, this is, this slick site is clearly some legitimate source. But I think people need to also understand, they have to learn, just like you do AI trainings and how to use LLMs, you need to understand more, you have to learn about the media ecosystem as well.
100%. And I think part of this goes back to, as a political conservative, we've always been concerned about sort of what we perceive, rightly or wrongly, as a liberal bias in the media, right? But the real truth is that as much as you might not like the liberal bias, the quote-unquote liberal bias in the media, you certainly don't want Russian media taking that place or Chinese media taking that place. And unfortunately, I think that conservatives, my part of the party, have lost our way. We've gotten so upset with American mainstream media that we're willing to fight the battle on behalf of foreign state actors who are doing things even worse and say, well, we need to open everything up. That's crazy. It is better to have American media with whatever biases it has and bring in a balanced view of those, rather than to say, well, we just need to have an open scenario and have everyone come in and mandate equal time for all the people. That's crazy and wrong-handed and not where conservatives should be.
Well, as a liberal, I think that's a great point to end on. Fully agree. Well, thank you so much. I guess we can move to Q&A now, if folks have questions.
Hi, thank you guys so much for being here today. My name is Shivan Anand. I'm with the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. This might be a question more geared towards you, Jamil, but there's this notion of the digital Silk Road and the Chinese effort to sell their cheaper AI models to countries that don't have an abundance of options and maybe don't have the ability to choose. What do you say to them as a threat that Chinese AI presents, and what is the angle that the United States and its foreign policy and its foreign tools can play to sort of combat that in an effort to win this great power competition?
Yeah, it's a great question. And what I'd say to them is, how has collaborating with the Chinese for the last 2 decades worked for you, right? If you're a country in Africa or a country anywhere else in the world, Southeast Asia, anywhere else, and you've been working with the Chinese, how has it worked for you on minerals? How's it worked for you on development? They throw a bunch of money at you. They bring in cheap labor. Is it your labor that's being used? No. They're giving you loans. How's that going for you? Debt diplomacy, right? We know how it's played out. Expect the same thing on AI. They're trying to addict you to their capabilities, like they did with Huawei and ZTE, and they're using it to collect, and using it to shape, and using it to put you in their camp. If you want to be a player, you want to help you want to help your country, you want to gain the leg up, relying on the Chinese who have ulterior motives is not the right play. And those countries might say, well, the U.S. has ulterior motives as well. Europe has ulterior motives. Everyone's got a problem, and so we're just going to roll our own. Maybe so, but if you're going to pick one, you got to decide who's the better actor in this domain. You've tried the Chinese for 20 years. How's it gone?
If I can add a comment to that, some of the responsibility there also, or like it behooves the American AI companies also to invest more in open source models.
I agree.
They have all said that they were going to invest more in that. And in the AI action plan by the federal government over the summer, they said they were going to encourage a lot more open source development.
Hasn't happened.
No, it hasn't happened. And so we don't want the world to be divided into you're going with China, you're going to the US, but that we need to create more options. We need to make ourselves more competitive for the developing world.
Well, and look, and the other piece of this, to your question is what can the U.S. government do about it, right? I do think we made a mistake by sort of taking all of American soft power off the table, right? And I think that was a huge mistake. No doubt there were problems with those programs. There were programs that had gone wildly off track. That stuff needs to be rolled back and corrected for. That doesn't mean you throw the baby out with the bathwater. And unfortunately, the moves we made on American soft power have dramatically undermined our influence in these very countries where we need to be winning hearts, minds, and AI adoption for our American companies. We want to collaborate with technology companies. Winning AI adoption for our companies is something the American government should be actively engaged in. And taking our soft power off the table, taking USAID out of the game, that's a mistake. Again, not to make excuses for all the problems of those programs. There's a lot that needs to be fixed, but throwing the baby out with the bathwater is not the right answer either.
Hi, I'm Lauren Williamson. I'm with the Alexander Hamilton Society. Phenomenal conversation here, and so my question is, whose responsibility is it to educate consumers on what they'll come into contact with on social media or with ChatGPT or Claude or DeepSeek, and kind of who or what do you think has enough credibility at this point to be taken seriously by the consumer? For this scope, we can just say the US, but of course that applies globally. And what kind of pushback do you expect from both companies like OpenAI and state governments as well? So I think kind of the question at the heart of this is who gets to decide the narrative that consumers accept or create the tools, I think, that consumers use to weigh how credible AI platforms that they're using are. And so I think that could look different for each demographic of the population, but I'm wondering what your thoughts are on that. Thank you.
I have an icky DC phrase in my in my throat that is whole of society approach. I mean, these companies have responsibilities for saying what their vulnerabilities are. Researchers have responsibilities for continuing to test that and make sure they're being honest with us. Journalists have responsibilities to educate people. Schools, like you said, everyone has a little bit to give here, I think.
I don't think that's icky. I think that's totally right. And one of the things that we've done at FDD is kind of studied countries who are more used to being inundated with disinformation and how they're educating their population around it. So it's everything from tools to, we mentioned, education in the classroom, teaching kids from a young age, not just these are the tools you're going to use, but these are the risks associated with them.
Yeah.
So I completely agree with you. It has to come from everywhere.
And it's got to start early. I mean, K through 12, kids are using these tools today. They've got to learn how to be skeptical and how to sort of push back with the AI. I guess I should say this publicly, but I share a ChatGPT account with my son, so I can watch all the questions he's asking. He can see all what I'm asking, and it is awesome. It is wild to watch because I see him argue with the and ask questions, and it's clear that like somebody, I don't know if it's the public school system in Arlington or us or whatever, but somebody has taught him how to argue with the AI and get to the truth, and it's awesome. And if it can happen to him and he's 16, it can happen to every kid in America, but you as a parent and as a family and as educators, you cannot be scared of these tools. You cannot take them off the table. If you're at a law school like I am, you can't be like, oh, we'll just ignore that whole AI revolution. You've got to adopt, you've got to embrace, and you've got to teach your students, your children, K through 12, all the way through, to my parents, my mom. You've got to teach them how to ask the questions the right way to get to the truth. Yeah. And that critical thinking is the thing that will ultimately, everyone's always, AI is going to take over the world and they're going to replace all these jobs. The reality is that if we teach our kids and our families and our adults right, this is actually going to enhance human creativity. It's going to dramatically up-level people. It's going to be a leveler, not an underminer. And I think there's a real opportunity here, but critical thinking and pressing and educating yourself. By the way, AI think about all the education that the internet put at our fingertips. AI gives you easy colloquial access to all that information. You can retrain people in jobs. You can gain a huge amount of learning and up-level people that didn't have access to good schools, that didn't have access to college education. This is a dramatic game changer for the average American, including and the average person around the globe, including people who don't have access to a lot of these things. I think there's a huge opportunity here.
That's great. And I know you're a real China expert, but I didn't know you were kind of modeling that kind of surveillance at home with your own child.
There you go. Yep. It is like the CCP in the house.
Do we have time for one more question, perhaps, or we're good? Okay. Oh.
Hi, Mary Brooks. I'm also a professional researcher. So my question for the researchers, as we are trying to figure out how to integrate new technology into our workflows without completely giving over control to the LLMs. Kind of one of the following two questions. One, are there any tricks or tips that you have found to be really, really effective that kind of turbocharge your work without, again, giving over too much control to the LLM? Or do you have a fun anecdote example from your research that was like a like amazing moment where you really found kind of like a shocking thing that you wanted to share?
I can say, as I mentioned, Al Jazeera was just masterful at optimizing their content for AI. And so the next step in my research journey here is to look at Common Crawl and the presence of different outlets in training data. I think that's the next step to analyze.
The new SEO.
Yeah.
Are you talking about like future research or in my own research how I use AI? Simple things. I don't want it to think for me, but if I have a task that could be easily automated, like for example, I'm looking at an information operation, I'm pulling dozens and dozens of posts, I want to know what the key word is in each of those, or what country was mentioned in each of those, throw it in ChatGPT or Claude and see what it says. It just makes it faster. I don't feel like I lose anything from
My
that
favorite
process.
technique is I'll take output from one LLM and put it into another and say critique this. This is what Gemini told me. Critique it. Give me your own view. Is this right? Is this wrong? And I'll go back and forth. I really want to build an app that does that for me in real time. So I'm gonna have my son work on that for me and get that done. Then we all can buy it.
I will also say, super technical things, it's been helpful for me because I don't come from a technical background. So if I want to look at like the page source of a domain or something like that, I can plug it in and ask questions about that too, which will give me a good lead to then go ask an expert to verify it for me.
That's very helpful. Well, thank you so much, everyone. Thank you to our panelists. We really appreciate your time and for sharing your expertise. Thank you. I forgot to mention, for more information on FDD and the latest analysis on these issues, we encourage you to visit fdd.org, and we hope to see you again soon.